Well, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer just said that Australians are doing it tough, and he's right. He pointed out that prices have increased, that rents have increased, and many families are struggling to make ends meet. And he's right about all of those things. But what he's not right about is the cause of that pressure on Australian family budgets. And the cause of that pressure is that the previous government left inflation running at record high levels, and inflation under this government has been cut in half. The Shadow Minister spent a lot of time talking about the prices of energy and rents and other family costs. What he didn't tell you is the trajectory of those prices since his government left office and our government began. Let's start taking them one by one. Energy costs. When his government left office, they were forecasting electricity costs to increase by 20% in the following year. A 20% annual increase. That's not something they were upfront about in the election period, but that was information that they had provided to the then Energy Minister, now Shadow Treasurer. Subsequently, the runs are on the board. The latest inflation numbers that were released week before last showed that electricity prices in the last quarter fell by 1.5%. So we've taken electricity prices that were running at 20% before the last election, when the Liberals had stewardship, to a reduction of 1.5% in the most recent quarterly numbers. Similarly, the most recent quarterly numbers identify that gas prices in Australia, the gas component of the CPI, has fallen by 1.7% in the latest quarterly numbers. So I'm sure that the empathy that the Shadow Assistant Treasurer speaks of for Australian families doing it tough is well meant. I'm sure that it is sincere. But unfortunately, the only thing that those Australian families have to rely on is that the reason why their prices were going up so much is because the Liberals left a legacy of high inflation across the board. And the hope that those families have is that the Labor government continues the work that it has done to reduce prices across the board, to halve inflation and to reduce pressure on interest rates. The truth is that if we had left inflation running at the level that the Liberals left it at, which was 2.1% quarterly growth in the last quarter printed before they left office, if we had left inflation running at that level, the average Australian family would be paying $200 more a week for their expenses. If we'd left inflation at that level, prices today would be 17% higher now than they were at the time of the election. So it's true that Australian families are doing it tough. It's true that prices have risen, but they've risen by a lot less than they would have risen if we had left the rate of inflation that the Liberals were running stay intact. But that is not what we have done, Deputy Speaker. What we've done is work to reduce the level of inflation in Australia through prudent budget measures that have helped take the pressure off prices, provide fiscal surpluses and reduce the cumulative underlying cash balance by $214 billion. This is one of the largest fiscal turnarounds in Australian history. Indeed, it's one of the largest fiscal turnarounds in world history. We've reduced the cumulative deficits by around 2/3 over the 6 years to 2028. We found $105 billion in responsible savings and budget improvements, and doing so has avoided around $80 billion in interest payments over the medium term. What we've delivered is the first budget surplus, in fact, back-to-back surpluses, not back-to-black surpluses, that was their idea, back-to-back surpluses for the first time in 15 years. And Speaker, this is the hope that Australian families have, that we can bring down inflation from the horrific levels left by the Liberal government through prudent and responsible fiscal management that they have seen in the last two budgets, and that provides relief to families on their daily pressures and ultimately provides relief as it gives more room to the RBA to also bring down interest rates. That's the hope for Australian families, and that's what Labor is delivering.